All right, today on The Explainer, we are digging into one of the biggest, most enduring mysteries in pop culture history, the death of the king himself, Elvis Presley. I mean, this was a guy who was basically a cultural Big Bang. You've probably heard that famous John Lennon quote, "Before Elvis, there was nothing." He literally started it all. And the story of how he died, well, it's become a legend, right? But what if that story, the one we've all heard for decades, is just wrong? New research is flipping the entire narrative on its head. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so first up, let's just quickly go over the official story, the myth that's been told for, over 40 years now? So, August 16th, 1977, the world gets the news. The king of rock and roll is gone. At just 42 years old, it was a total shock. And almost immediately, a simple, very tragic story started to form. And that story was pretty straightforward. Rock and roll excess, obesity, drug abuse. Basically a story of a superstar who just couldn't handle the fame and destroyed himself. But what if that's not the real story? The evidence we have now points to something way more complex.
So let's get into part 2, A Destiny in DNA. Because a really groundbreaking investigation is making a powerful case that Elvis's fate wasn't about his choices at all. It might have been written into his very DNA from the moment he was born.
Yeah, in her book, Destined to Die Young, journalist Sally Hoedel totally reframes the narrative. She argues this wasn't a story of addiction. It was a story of a man in a lifelong, private battle with diseases he inherited. So where does this trail begin? Well, it actually starts with his grandparents on his mom's side. They were first cousins, which, can definitely increase the risk of genetic problems. And it looks like they passed on a chromosomal anomaly to Elvis's mother, Gladys. And here's the really tragic part. Gladys died at just 46, and the way her health declined, it was almost a mirror image of what would happen to her son. So because of this genetic lottery, Elvis was born fighting a war on multiple fronts. He had conditions like alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which affects the lungs, problems with his immune system, and Hirschsprung's disease, a really painful bowel condition. All told, he had documented diseases in 9 out of his body's 11 systems. It's just incredible. His body was literally at war with itself from birth. So you see, with that genetic blueprint as the backdrop, his life starts to look a whole lot different. Less like a rock and roll party and way more like a lifelong hidden battle. Now, what's really fascinating is when you actually map out his health issues, you see this clear pattern of decline, and it starts way earlier than most people think. We're talking childhood, malnourished, severe insomnia. Then, by 1964, he's only 29 years old and he needs an oxygen mask just to function. By age 35, he's got painful glaucoma, and then you hit 1973. That's the beginning of the end, really, the start of a 4-year free fall in his health. Okay, so this brings us to the big question, right? The one that's defined his legacy. What about all the drugs? Was he an addict? Well, this is where the story gets turned on its head. The myth is that it was all reckless addiction just for kicks. But the reality? It looks like it was medically necessary treatment for chronic, absolutely debilitating pain from all those diseases we just talked about. This wasn't for pleasure. It was a desperate attempt just to manage. And listen to this. His own nurse, Marion Koch, said, and I'm quoting here, "There were several times when he would receive a narcotic by injection for pain every 4 hours. Every 4 hours. We're talking about a level of suffering that required constant medical intervention just for him to function. It's a whole different picture." All right, so that brings us to the end. The truth about that fateful day in 1977. If it wasn't a simple overdose, then what actually killed the king? Believe it or not, the autopsy evidence itself basically throws the whole overdose story out the window. Now yes, 11 different drugs were found in his system, but, and this is the key part, every single one was confirmed to be in a range that was consistent with therapy. The toxicology flat out contradicts the idea of an overdose. So what really happened was this tragic, fatal domino effect. It all starts with that Hirschsprung's disease we mentioned. It caused his colon to become just massive, hugely enlarged. Well, that giant organ started pressing on everything around it, his diaphragm, his lungs, his heart. And then the final domino. A simple physical strain, something called a Valsalva maneuver, was all it took. It put just enough pressure on his heart to trigger a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. So yes, the official cause was cardiac arrest,
But the root cause, the thing that set it all in motion, it was a genetic disease he was born with. And despite all these myths surrounding his death, his power, his influence, it hasn't faded one bit. Decades later, Elvis is, well, he's everywhere. I mean, we're talking about a legacy so huge that the legendary conductor Leonard Bernstein said he was the greatest cultural force in the 20th century. Not just a singer, a cultural force. That's incredible. And his legacy shows up in the most random, unexpected places you can imagine. I'm not kidding. In computer programming, there's literally a piece of code called the Elvis operator. And why? Because the symbol, a question mark, and a colon, if you turn your head sideways, it looks like an emoticon of Elvis with that famous hairdo. That's right, the king's influence extends all the way into programming languages. How wild is that? And that really leaves us with one last, kind of profound question. When you understand this side of the story, this lifelong battle he was fighting, you just have to wonder, if Elvis were born today, with everything we know now about medicine and genetics, could we have given him a longer life? Could we have changed his destiny?